Today, we honor the sacrifice and valor of our nation's heroes, remembering February 23, 1945, a moment from the Battle of Iwo Jima that would inspire the world. One of the bloodiest battlefields of World War II, U.S. Marines fought for control of Mount Suribachi. Among those fighting were young men from Maine, teenagers and young adults who left their hometowns to defend our freedom. They came from Holton, Bangor, and across communities all over the state. When the Marines reached their crest, they raised the American flag. Photographer Joe Rosenthal captured the moment. That image, 6 Marines raising the flag on that mountain, became one of the most iconic photographs in American history. Nearly 2,200 Mainers gave their lives in World War II. Many fought at Iwo Jima. Some never came home. Those who did carried the weight of what they saw there, the courage, the loss, the brotherhood that bound them together.